Hi listeners, thanks again for joining for another episode in my Ellevate series with your host, me, Becky. In this podcast, we talk about all things women empowerment, challenges in the recruitment industry, career progression, and anything else that is empowering women in business. Thanks for listening, and please remember to follow and subscribe for all updates. Hi everyone, thank you again for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation about motherhood in the workplace with Collette Swindells. I think it's a super important and relevant topic for many women in the workplace. I think it's one of those that doesn't always get spoken about for women as they're kind of climbing their career ladders until they're sort of, I guess, plummeted into the stage of motherhood, which obviously lucky for those who can be in that situation. But I think it's, I think it doesn't necessarily have a taboo, but there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily talk about. So really looking forward to this conversation. Collette and I have known each other for quite a while, actually, been in touch about certain positions and hiring, and also Collette's come to a few of our events before in Copenhagen. So Collette, thank you so much for joining. Really looking forward to this topic. Do you want to start out and give a bit of an introduction on yourself, and we can then dive into it?
Sure. Well, I'm a bit of a Bitzer. When people say, where do you come from? I usually say that. I come from a Bitzer of this, a bit of that. So I was originally born in Scotland. As you can hear from my accent, I was raised in Australia, but I've actually been living in Denmark for the last 7 years. So along the way, I've also lived in Spain and France. So I've had a bit of a spotted history. So originally I studied architecture, actually, and then ended up in journalism. And along the way, I've also done everything from photography to business management and even fashion design. So it's a bit of a mixed experience from my side. But currently I'm working as the VP of Marketing at Ocean.io, which is a B2B data platform. But as I said before, I originally started my career as a journalist for design magazines, so writing about architecture and industrial design and fashion. And then I sort of jumped the fence, as they say, and went into marketing and PR and branding, and then ended up working for consumer brands, and finally now in marketing for tech companies.
Amazing. Cool. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, let's dive into it. So let's discuss what it's like to be a mother and return to work. It's actually not something I'm familiar with. So it's really great to hear from yourself on this kind of topic. So as I mentioned, I think it's not discussed enough, and it's certainly not spoken too much about until it's happening, right? So I guess if we break up the process into stages of before going on maternity leave, whilst on mat leave, and then perhaps coming back from that cycle, what kind of things do you go through during those times? And how do you think, or how do those sort of things change for mothers during these periods? I appreciate everyone's going to have very unique situations, but how did you find it?
Yeah, well, I mean, motherhood was something that I always sort of thought would happen, but nothing I really actively set out to sort of make happen. And so I had worked a lot on my career, and when I did get pregnant, it was somewhat of a surprise, a very happy surprise. And it wasn't something that I had kind of scheduled into my career. So there was a lot of things that I had to kind of go through because, often it comes in at the time I was working at a sort of small startup. I was the head of marketing there. I was working on a very big project, redoing the brand and trying to sort of push them into the next level. And suddenly, as soon as you find out you're pregnant, there's a timer on. So that comes with it, with some stress, because you've got an end date, and there is no getting around that. You can't, unlike everything else in your career, you can't extend the deadline. You can't ask for more time. You can't buy your way through it. So for me, it meant that I had to hire new staff, onboard them, finish my work, and sort of somehow keep myself fit and healthy in the pregnancy. So it was a lot of things to juggle at once. So I think particularly when you are pregnant and you're a first-time mum, that's can be quite confronting. For me, actually, it meant I was quite sick throughout my pregnancy. And so I actually ended up going on maternity leave early because I was unwell. I was still traveling till 36 weeks. So I was going across to London. We were doing events and all that was fine until small little things kind of get in the way. And I think it's kind of trying to remove all the little hurdles. So particularly in the beginning, just to sort of be mindful that you are, even if you don't get sick, you're making a baby inside you and your body's like full of hormones. You're under a lot of pressure sort of to perform physically, but also mentally at work, and anything you can do to sort of remove that is a good idea. And, as much as people sort of understand that this is stuff that happens in pregnancy, until you go through it, it feels a bit uncomfortable, especially when, kind of you're in a position of leadership in a company. If I move on to sort of like while I was on leave, I really, really enjoyed that, being on maternity leave. I'm lucky because I'm in Denmark. We get a good amount of time. Most workplaces will give you sort of 4 to 6 months full pay, and then it's up to you to sort of organise how you do the rest of it, whether you're alone or with a partner. But most people will take up to 12 months off. I think for me, I took about, it was like 10 or 11 months off. So I was able to sort of plan that out, which was good. And, I had like some savings, which was also very important to sort of have pre-prepared, because that bought me extra time. And so, I know not all women are lucky, but I really counted my blessings in that regard, being in Denmark, and was able to enjoy every day of kind of being a new mum. But it was difficult, because your whole life has changed completely overnight, and you have to adjust to this new personality and this new person, and the fact that your role is just 100% devoted to looking after someone else, which when you've been kind of in a career and focused very much on yourself or on your company and growing that, that can be a little bit confronting. So, I think it's very much sort of thinking about like not to stress yourself, not to try and think about work too much before you go back, and just try and trust that by the time you get there, you'll be ready. Allow yourself to just enjoy those moments where it's just about this one thing that you're doing. And also, obviously, the physical recovery for yourself. You've still got hormones and everything going on, especially if you're breastfeeding. It's very physically demanding. Keep yourself and your distance away from work. Try not to stress and worry about what it's going to look like when you get back. Sort of cross that bridge when you get to it. And I think, most of the time when you've got this little child like in front of you, you're so full of like all the things that you need to do for them. But I think towards the end, I did start to sort of wonder what was going to happen. And I think going back initially for me, it was easy. I felt ready because I'd done a really good transition with the childcare. I spent a lot of time actually choosing where I should put my daughter. And I think that was very much key in me feeling okay to go back to work. So I was trusting that she was in a good space. When I got back, there was an adjustment for me. It did feel a bit strange. I felt a little bit out of step, out of everything. It was like you had to be re-onboarded again. You're sort of like a new employee, but kind of also trying to remember what had happened before and kind of connect the dots. And especially again, as the manager who's in charge of the strategy, that can be a little bit tricky. But luckily I'd done a kind of pretty big handover report. So I sort of referred back to that and sort of eased myself back in. The coming back process, is all about communication and getting the right amount, not overwhelming yourself, and just kind of finding your way and your balance.
Yeah, I can imagine that the combination of the physical changes and stresses, the emotional, obviously a whole new accountability that you have. And then that's coupled with the fact that, I guess you could say you've been out of the loop for whatever 3, 6, 9, 12 months, however long it might be. And that must be quite a challenge as well for somebody who's been super career driven. You've always kind of maybe at least felt like you've been in control on what that can look like and where your next steps are going to be. And then to have, a totally different challenge on your plate. I'm sure that's another mental and emotional stress as well, right? From your experience, I guess, what can good look like during those 3 stages? And how about not so good?
Well, I think what I sort of say now, particularly, and just to clarify, I'm a single mom, so my experience is quite heightened. I don't have also family support in Denmark. I'm by myself, so I rely on a lot of friend family to help. But I think what I sort of generally say to people who haven't got kids yet, or are considering it, and I get some other single women that come to me and say, I want to do this. What does it look like? And I just say, well, my daughter is a multiplier, as all kids are. They're just a multiplier of everything. And you can't tell what sort of multiplier they are, whether it's 2x, 3x. And I guess I come from a marketing and business world, so you're used to thinking about those sorts of results. But I mean, that goes in both ways. That goes from the stresses, but also the highs, and the kind of good moments. So I think the key for all phases is just to kind of really get clear on what's essential and removing all the other little things along the way. So I think before you go away, it's remembering to rest and sort of save time, transitioning to less and less as you go along. Like, don't run 80 miles an hour into a wall, because there isn't time in between sort of finishing work usually and a baby being born. And it can often happen with a few surprises. I've had some colleagues who were also still working and the babies came early. So you don't want that to happen. So for sure, if you can, just start to transition, start to hand things over, reduce your work down, sort of get yourself in line for this period where you're not going to do anything, because your body is under a lot of demands, and you don't really want to add your mind to that. So try to start shutting things down bit by bit. And I think that's also good just to handle expectations from your work side as well. When you're actually on maternity leave, I think the key thing is just to enjoy it and let it be what it is. You really have no idea what sort of child you're going to get. Some are having issues with, reflux. Some have, issues with sleep. Some don't latch properly. Every child has its own challenges, and every mother does. So I think you can't pre-plan that. You just have to sort of be in the moment and deal with whatever hits you each day. And you really don't need to think about anything else. You just sort of focus on the task at hand and find your new rhythm. And I think here it's like work can really seem like a million miles away, and it can feel a little bit strange, especially if you go into the office and show off your new baby. I think that while it's sort of nice and cozy, that can also be a little bit jarring. So just be careful that you're not then stepping into that world again. You only get this time once, and, just really try and protect and honor that, and just be where you need to be, and just trust again that things will be okay when you get back to work. So I think, like, coming back, the ideal situation would be to sort of make a plan ahead of time. Ideally before you leave, think about the things that you might be willing to sort of change or drop or adjust with your new life. As I said, every child is different. You might have challenges. You don't know where you're going to be on that sort of spectrum. So just trying to get real about what is essential to your job might be a good idea, either before you go, and also maybe when you come back, reassess your job description and what the projects are, look at what the new strategies and things are that are in place at the time, and see what's changed, and see what can you sort of alter in your approach to make it easier on yourself. And also, this can be a good time to sort of think about, what next is there for you, and is that something sort of new or different, or just the same but a little bit altered.
Amazing. And so we'll kind of dive a bit more into that pre-planning strategy in a second, but what's the accountability split between, say, the employee and the employer?
Yeah, I think for us, it's like it differs quite a lot, like country to country. And I say that because in Denmark, it's pretty clear that you don't have to do too much. So basically, you just need to tell them 3 months before you give birth that you are pregnant. I mean, most people will guess that. But then you just need to notify them 1 month before you come back when you plan to do that. I mean, usually I'm someone who advocates for more communication, rather over-communicate than under-communicate. But I think in this instance, less is definitely more. As I said, you don't want your mind being taken over to things at work before you actually get back. I did sort of have a few instances of that where, it was suggested, why don't you come in? Let's have some meetings before you come back. And I did speak to my union about that because I felt a little bit uneasy. In the last month, I was definitely transitioning my daughter to her childcare, and I wanted to really focus on that. So I felt sort of a little bit uneasy with being asked to come in before I was officially back. And I did check sort of my rights, and they said, look, you don't need to do anything. Obviously, they're asking something that's a favor, and you're also not being paid. So for me, it was also about, the insurance behind that, and the fact that if I went into work, I'm not officially there. So would I be covered if anything happened? So I just kind of went back to the legal side of that and, pushed back and said no. And we just waited until I got back. So yeah, I think that for me is a better way to be. Just be clear in your communication. And reach out to people who have the expertise to help you on that if it's a kind of grey zone or a legal matter.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess, as you said, that each country or each maybe region is slightly different in that sense, but kind of going back to the point around enjoy that time while you have it, right? Because it doesn't last forever. And having your mind already jumping into the next project or the next meetings it's probably quite difficult because you can't give your full self to that. At that point anyways. So okay. And going back to then this the pre-planning strategy, did you have like a roadmap carved out with your employer? How did that look, and how did you go about that?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit of a planner, so we did have a rough plan, and I had an idea about what I wanted to do, sort of coming back a little bit early so that we could also go away for a holiday just when we first got back, sort of to stagger out, my return. But I must say I wasn't very good about putting that into writing. So it was built on a lot of trust and verbal communication at the time. And in hindsight, I definitely should have gotten it written down and signed off on. We had some communications, but I think when I got back, things had changed, particularly common in businesses and startups that are moving pretty fast. And the company wasn't in the same position when I returned, 10 months later. So that kind of verbal agreement, while I felt like it was kind of locked away, for them, they were like, things have changed, that's no longer possible. And, I think that's where we had a mismatch of expectations. It had a big impact on my life. And for them, it was just, stuff's changed, you adapt. And I was like, no, I'm waiting out for this, this is what I've pre-planned. And so I think I had done myself a disservice. I hadn't gotten that sort of locked away. So definitely in hindsight, I would go back and do that. And I think what it did, it meant that, it was one of those things that was a sort of a bit of a deal breaker for me. So it meant that, from my side, we had a different relationship now. And, in the end, I decided that was enough for me to sort of look for another position. Because I didn't feel like then the relationship was going to be on an even footing, or just that it was going to support me in the next phase.
It goes back to the point around the communication too, right? I think if you can be clear and upfront about it, hopefully there's no surprises at the end, because that coupled with the whole change that you go through, it's a lot, right? And I would imagine you don't need the added stresses.
Yeah, and doing it, like, I think ahead of time, like when you're not so emotional, when it doesn't mean as much. And also, again, getting the support and maybe legal advice from like a union or someone else who's been through it as to how to handle it, I think, because it can be awkward to ask for those things.
And it goes back to that point where, you've never been in this situation before, you don't know, or, you don't know how you're going to feel. And I suppose you don't know whether or not it's out of line to ask for those kind of things. But seeking advice from those who've done it before, or legally, it's definitely worth doing that kind of thing. Was there anything that you needed when you returned from work from your employer that maybe you either didn't anticipate or you did anticipate and it was different from what you had before?
Yeah, I mean, I was previously like someone who loved to go to the office. I loved to be there and have a coffee and a chit chat and, have all that sort of social engagement with my colleagues. But I think that definitely changed where I actually saw the value in having the ability to work from home, because that meant, I didn't have to get as dressed up. I didn't have to spend that extra half an hour on sort of getting myself ready, and also, the 30 to 40 minutes commuting. And all those little bits of time started to be more valuable for me to have, to maybe take an extra coffee break and put on a load of laundry, or do small tasks, in between to clear my head. So I think, even after the pandemic, there's a lot of workplaces that are not happy with this sort of arrangement. And I found myself in that sort of situation where, they really wanted people in the office. And, for me, that wasn't as attractive anymore. So it was kind of another push for me to look for a different workplace that could support me in that. I think another thing, like luckily by law in Denmark, you get the first day off when your child is sick so that you can sort of organise stuff. And that's been super helpful also because, when they first start childcare, they have to build up immunity. They're often quite sick. I've been lucky my daughter hasn't been as sick as some kids, but we've had that day just to sort of sort ourselves out. But also, that's just because I'm in Denmark. So I think having that ability to work from home if you then have a sick child is very key. And just having sort of maybe flexible work hours. I think what I tend to do now is I often do stuff very early in the morning while we're sort of having breakfast. I might just glance over my emails and check my inbox while she's having a little bit of a play or so. And then I know what's happening for the day, and then I'll often drop her off early so that I can start my day early. So I think just having those flexible work hours, has really helped me so that I can sort of start early, finish early, and maybe log on later at night. But I think, my workload hasn't changed so much. I still perform kind of at the same level, but I'm a lot more efficient with my time. And this is a double-edged sword because, I don't have those chit-chats as much by the coffee machine.
Sure.
So, the things that would have taken me to the office before are kind of less valuable to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm really trying to focus on getting my job done, which can have some other unintended consequences. So it's just something to also think about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you can't, in a perfect world, we would have more time, but it's just not possible, right? So going back to that point around prioritization and figuring out what you do need to do, and obviously making that work for yourself and your daughter as well. So just on the topic of, you mentioned obviously in Denmark, you've got some specific kind of laws and rules. Have you had a different experience? I know you mentioned you've obviously got family and friends in Australia, also in the UK. Have you had a different experience to them, for example?
Yeah, I think very much so. And that's been one of the reasons why I've stayed in Denmark. I have looked at jobs in the UK and also back in Australia, and I've really wrestled with that, to have the family support. But right now, the childcare is really what makes our life work. And the thing about childcare in Denmark is it's a right and an entitlement in Denmark. So even if you don't get into your preferred place, they will give you an actual guaranteed place until you can get in there. And that's something that I don't see in Australia and also in the UK. I've had friends in Australia who haven't been able to work full-time jobs because they just don't have childcare. Or if they do, it's not full-time. So they've had to forfeit working to look after their children, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but, often it's also just too expensive for what they're earning. And that is a bit of a tough choice when you're choosing economically, whether you have a career or whether your, sort of child gets looked after. And I think that personally, I don't think that anyone should have to make that choice. I don't think that that's fair. So I do very much value the way the Danish society is set up. So I think also in the UK, the price is quite substantial. And when I sort of looked at what I would then have to pay, to live there, what I was earning, it takes care of a huge chunk of your earnings. And as a single parent, I just couldn't make it work. Definitely not until she's at least in sort of school and, a little bit more independent and, less reliant on me. So, yeah, being in Denmark for sure was the best place for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's definitely some underlying cultural differences in values, and that's probably reflected in the policies as well, right? I think, yeah, the cost is astronomical, and for sure the UK and other Western European countries and perhaps Australia too, by the sounds of it. And yeah, it's just really tough, right, for women if they're in the situation where it's like, well, we have to make a choice now. Is it the career that I've been working for X amount of years to get me to this point, and now I have to stop for a period of time until the child is maybe in school, or can I make it work, and can I continue that on that pace, on that career ladder? Again, going back to the point, there's no perfect scenario, but yeah, having to make those choices certainly makes it more difficult. So maybe we need to take a leaf out of the Danes' book on those policies. What about if you're in like a really full throttle role and it requires a lot from you, like before the baby arrives, and then after the baby arrives, like you feel like you maybe cannot give the same amount of time, is probably the wrong word, but energy, concentration, full resource and time. Should you consider, going back to that point, should you consider a change in your role? Did you go through that kind of thought process? And if so, like, where did you get to with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really tricky one because, again, you've got sort of your career and the business and what they're trying to expect of you, and, your child, which, absolutely for me, at least, being a mum is number one. You just can't ignore that. And, it's a marathon, not a sprint. The investments you make now are lifelong. And particularly in the first years, it's so critical to give that care and attention. I think being a mum is like, it's not a fixed contract. It's not just something that starts and ends, which your career does. It has a finite time. So I think being mindful of that, number one, and just maybe sort of thinking about how can you optimize for that. But I would say that with one little disclaimer, because I think a lot of the time women can feel like they're not doing as much. And yet, in fact, they actually are performing and no one really notices it. And they're doing so much and they're not giving themselves enough credit. So I think in one hand, I would say, yes, make some changes. But on the other hand, I would say just go slowly with it, because get some feedback from other people. Do they actually think that you're not doing enough or good enough? Getting real about your career and also the expectations that your work puts on you. And maybe reassessing those, because also as women in careers, often we take on a lot more responsibility, not just in our roles, but caring for other members of the team, doing a lot of other, glue in the team sort of roles that is not often looked at. So I think taking a step back before you make a change is very valuable at this time. And it might be a really great time to actually reward yourself and acknowledge how much you actually do, and that it's okay that you actually pull back on some of those roles, because they were extra. They were not core to your role, but they were additional support you were giving.
Yeah, absolutely. I never thought about it like that. And I think it's really interesting perspective is, give yourself a bit of confidence and give it a go. And then, yes, if it is simply unmanageable with maybe travel or whatever might be the specific scenario, then it's worth revisiting with your employer. But if it's just a case of being a super hard critic on yourself, then maybe it's worth giving it a go. And going back to your point around like the prioritization, right? Like you might not be able to go to every team bonding session, but you at the end of the day can still get the project done or whatever the rollout might be. It just might not be that you get to do all of the drinks and the coffee chats every single time, and because you have a different set of prioritizations now. So that makes a lot of sense. And I never really thought about it like that.
I mean, it's one other thing you can also do is make a request for your work to support you more.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is also an opportunity for them to prove who they are and for them to step up. I had a friend who actually made a request for extra salary because she had new financial demands. She felt she was still bringing her A game and actually bringing more because of her optimizing, her whole life and being so much more efficient and clear about what was important. She asked for some more money, and that helped support her to get a nanny to help with the morning kind of sessions with the kids, so she could get ready and sort of head off to work before, everyone else started. And she got so much more out of her day, and they got so much more out of her just by giving her that a little bit of extra financial support. So it's also, I think it's a two-way street. And as I said, it's an opportunity for the workplace to also show how much they think you're worth and what value you contribute. It doesn't always have to be that you have to step back. Maybe you can step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if you're in a leadership role, I was thinking about delegation, right? Do I have to do every single task on this? Or have I upskilled part of my team in the last 12 months that they survived without me? So I'm sure they'll be able to take on some of these tasks, right? So yeah, that is an interesting way of thinking about it. So speaking of optimization, what kind of tips have you got, Collette, for any new moms who might be returning to work soon or perhaps into the future, or carers perhaps, around kind of getting back into that rhythm?
Yeah, well, I'm very big on this. I sort of, in that last month before I went back to work, I started thinking realistically about all the different things that I was going to have to do. So I did some really somewhat radical things. First off, I started with, okay, well, I've got to choose an outfit every day. And that could often take me half an hour in the morning before I was a mum. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to have time for that. So what can I do to pre-plan that? And so I kind of went to town a little bit on figuring out different outfits and actually separating out my wardrobe into my weekend clothes and my work clothes, which I always thought was a good idea, but never actually put aside the time to do this. So I took that opportunity just before I went to work to do that. And I actually kind of took it as a new time to buy a few new clothes, and just refresh my wardrobe as well. So yeah, I very much planned out all the different outfits so I could just kind of go into the wardrobe and just grab and go. I also started a meal plan, which I think was very helpful. That was in part sort of inspired by the childcare that my daughter goes to. Every week they send us their plan for all the meals. So I thought, you know what, I can borrow off this, and they have a soup day, they have a pasta day, they have a fish day and a meat day. And I thought, okay, I was actually coming from a very sort of more strict vegan lifestyle. And I knew I needed to also make sure my daughter was getting, a variety of foods. So it was a good opportunity for me to sort of reintroduce, a bit of meat and fish into both of our diets, just in a structured way. And it just meant that, each week, maybe I cook sort of 3 meals and then I batch cook. So we've got a frozen meal the next week. And that means I can just sort of heat things up. I would say the only problem with that is I think my daughter thinks the microwave is a cooking utensil. So I'm getting over the mum guilt with that. But I think, also having a little bit of a schedule and having the routines, systems and routines are there for a reason, to make life easier for us. So as much as it might feel like you're locked into something, there is a freedom in that. So I've kind of set up, regular, a dinner once a week with another sort of single mum. So every week we go, on a Friday, we go have pizza. We have another outing on a Sunday and we have another outing on a Wednesday. And that just kind of helps the time pass over and just remove some of the decision making from what's going on in the week. And I think that has really freed up my mind and my mental capacity to, focus on the decisions that are important. So yeah, that really has helped me.
Amazing. And did you experience any biases coming back to work as a mom? I think that's probably something that people don't even realize they're doing, right? And if so, what kind of advice would you give to someone who is experiencing this? I think I even sometimes have probably been guilty of it and sometimes it can be I guess, positive bias, but, you're already we spoke about it, right? You're already going through a huge amount of stress, physically, emotionally. You've been through a serious life change, and then to experience that kind of stuff when you come back to work is just not helpful, right? So yeah, what kind of biases did you experience any? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think people try not to have biases, but there definitely are some. As I said before, I start my day earlier than basically everyone in the office, but no one's there to see that. And that can be difficult because all they see is me leaving early every day. And I think, again, it's about the reality versus the perception. You have to manage those things. I think what I try to do is try to think about how what I do lands with others a little bit more. I think I was probably less conscious of that before because I was in the mass. I was just doing what everyone else was doing. But now that I'm sort of sticking out and I'm a bit more of an outlier, I have to make an extra effort to make sure that people sort of see what I'm doing. And also that I consider how it comes across to them. So I think I was initially just like, as I would start work, then I would start messaging people and doing stuff. Or also at the end of the day when I'm sending stuff when my daughter's gone to bed and I might just have one or two things that I want to do at 8:00 at night. I made sure now like that I pre-plan or sort of pre-schedule those messages so they go through in the morning. They don't come through to people, even if they've got their notifications off. So they're not sort of feeling bothered by me or that I'm working around the clock or that I'm not working enough. I think those are the two things that you balance. It's like people are like, oh, you're either working too much or not enough. And there just seems to be never anything in between. So if you can try and sort of program it so that you're only doing stuff within the hours that everyone else is there, that's a big help. So I think obviously some people who are parents, they get that. But others who aren't, and if you're working again in a sort of startup situation where a lot of people are quite young, they haven't got kids, they have a different viewpoint. It would be nice to come for a beer and that you would really like to, but your life is just a bit different. So that has been difficult, I think, particularly because I changed careers or changed companies while my daughter's still quite young. So it is harder to build those sort of relationships and that trust because you don't have those social interactions. So, you do have to make a point of maybe going to just chat to people in their offices a little bit more in the day or on the way to the coffee or just stopping at the coffee machine for a little bit longer and giving time to that in the day because you don't have that on the Friday. And occasionally maybe organising that you have a babysitter or something that you can do that. And maybe just also being open with people and saying, look, just casually sort of prompting them and reminding them that you're conscious of that. So I think it's just matching those expectations and their mentality and their way of thinking to kind of what you're doing and trying to bridge the gap between those two worlds with the communication.
Yeah, exactly. And I think kind of reminding yourself, like, at the end of the day, you're here to do a job. Of course, there's nice parts and the culture of a business is super important, but the reality is that's not really what you're here to do. And if you have other opportunities to build your relationships with the people in your team, then great. And, I think as well, like one thing I experienced is that maybe I don't always go for the beers with people, but, find something else that where you can bond with people. So we have like yoga sessions in the office, and I actually felt I got more out of that and was able to build better relationships with the folks who did the yoga classes instead. And so I think, yeah, as you say, in a startup, if it's typically quite a young environment, maybe the pub is or the drinks are common theme, but there's other ways of doing that. And maybe it's it's making the most of your lunch hour to sit with a different colleague and spend time with them or whatever it might be. So is the way that you've assessed your strengths and weaknesses different now that you're a mum?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as I said, like, and the common theme here is, having less time and energy to kind of handle things in general, but it forces you to be more on top of things. And I think like that is a double-edged sword because it doesn't always go down very well with people that you're living with such high levels of efficiency or immediacy. So, you've got to kind of get this stuff done now, and you're very happy and prepared to do that. But for some others, that can feel a little bit forced. So I think you, in one way, is a kind of a strength that you've got this kind of renewed sense of what is important. You have to also be mindful that not everyone's living in that same world and they're traveling at a different pace. So I guess, it is like a double-edged sword where sometimes, your new strength and your new sense of like what's important can become a bit of a weakness if you force that a bit too much and if it doesn't sort of match what other people are hoping or expecting. So it's really tough because you're juggling this clarity that you have, but also realizing that not everyone has that. It needs to be something that you manage and that you also communicate with people how you see things and what is going on for you and what your resources are and what time and energy you have to give to things, and that you can't always just answer whenever. What I also find now is that a lot of people like to leave things almost to the last minute of the day.
Yeah.
So come 4 o'clock, suddenly I'm getting all these messages and people want things done, and that's exactly when I can't do them.
Yeah.
So that can be a little bit challenging because I can't also jump on them until basically 8 o'clock when my daughter's asleep.
Yeah.
From 4 till 8 is kind of my peak time of mothering.
Yeah.
And that has become like a kind of weakness because people are then expecting at the end of the day when they want something that you're going to be able to jump on it. And they're used to, maybe that was your strength before, that you could quickly act when they needed it and you had that sense of urgency, but now your time is limited or just at a different end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that takes a bit of time to sort of massage people into a new situation with you. So yeah, again, it's just about communicating and making sure you keep people aware of where you are.
Exactly. Sounds like the underlying part of it is just like ensuring that your communication is strong to start with, and then the people are on board with that, right? If you think back to the first couple of weeks when you did return to work, what would you say was like the hardest part about it?
I think definitely the kind of the guilt of, being a sort of bad mum, having your kid in childcare, that you sort of really do want to be with your child. And I think that's the initial period, and I think that's very natural and normal as you transition back to work and your priorities change. So you sort of just have to sit with that. And then I think the harder thing is that after that initial guilt's gone, the guilt kind of reverses where you suddenly are back at work and you're starting to achieve stuff and you can tick things off a list and you get enjoyment, or at least I do, from having that happen and making things work. Whereas, a child is an unknown entity and every minute there's something new happening and you never quite fix it or solve it or get any sense of completion. So, coming to work and then feeling like you really enjoy it can also feel really hard because, it is, for me at least, sometimes easier to go to work and do stuff rather than looking after a child 24/7 who just pushes all your buttons. At least at work, most of the time, it's just, kind of mental capacity that you have to be there. A bit of emotional intelligence, but not so physically demanding, but a child is like getting you on all levels. So, that can be hard because, you're dealing with all of these emotions and feelings. Are you doing a good enough job? So yeah, I think again, just talking to other, my mum's group has been really pivotal in that. And I'm lucky to have found myself a group of sort of career-minded professional expat women who are often going through the same sort of issues that I am, and they're all, sort of back in their careers and juggling with the same problems. So just kind of normalizing that, I think, really helps.
Yeah, I can imagine having a network to reach out to and keep in touch with is super important. So yeah. But yeah, Collette, thank you so much. This conversation has been really inspiring, and it's so nice to hear like your experience. And, it sounds like there's definitely a lot of challenges that for sure obviously come along with motherhood, but it's really nice to hear like the highs as well, and I suppose insight on how it is transitioning back into the workplace. I think it's a really important topic, as I mentioned at the beginning. I'm sure the listeners will be really excited to listen to this because, I just don't think it is spoken about enough. So the more light we can shed for, upcoming moms or future moms or even employers who are having mums returning to work as well, it's really important to hear from all angles. So yeah, thank you so much. So we'll kind of wrap it up here with the last fun question. Where is next on your vacation bucket list?
Well, actually, I'm off to Vietnam and Australia tomorrow to see family and friends. But that said, I've actually just bought a backpack for hiking. so I can put my daughter on my shoulders.
Cool.
So we're actually hoping that in the next summer we'll go to maybe to Norway and do some hiking.
I really want to go there to like the fjords and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll look forward to hearing about that. But have an amazing time in Vietnam and Australia as well. And a very happy Christmas. And thank you again so much. We will speak to each other soon.
It was great to have a chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Collette.